They say you don't really need a door when you're old, when your life has shrunk down to mere shadows and whispers, when the world has already decided where you belong, or rather where you don't. The moment my son told me, "You don't really need a door, Mom. It's not like you have a life that requires privacy," I knew something inside me broke quietly, but irreparably. It wasn't just the absence of wood and hinges, the empty frame that once marked my space. It was the weight behind those words, the subtle but brutal erasure of my presence and dignity. In a house that I had helped to build, where I had raised my children, where I had dreamed of growing old. That thin floral curtain hanging now in place of my bedroom door was less about letting in light or creating openness. It was a calculated symbol, a daily reminder that I was no longer entitled to boundaries or respect, that my privacy and autonomy were negotiable and, in their eyes, irrelevant. I am 74 years old. I have lived in this curtained room for nearly a year now, a guest in my own son's home, where my belongings have been sorted, shuffled, and sometimes discarded without notice or consent. Outside this flimsy fabric, the world moves on as if I am invisible. And inside, I cling to memories of who I once was, quietly nursing the fragments of my self-worth. But this was not always my reality. There was a time when I had a solid door, a locked sanctuary of my own, when my voice carried weight, when my presence demanded attention and affection. Back then, I was the woman who baked pies with warm hands, who patched scraped knees and listened without judgment, who held the family's heart with steady, relentless care. Now, the curtain sways softly every time someone passes by, a whispering mockery of the boundary that once stood firm. It is through this curtain that my son's children enter uninvited, their footsteps loud in the silence of my exclusion, their laughter an echo of a family that no longer includes me. They don't knock. They don't ask. They simply cross the threshold, as if my space is no different than any hallway or closet. Sometimes, when the house settles at night and the voices fade into muted murmurs, I sit on the edge of the narrow bed and run my fingers over the threadbare quilt that covers me, tracing patterns of resilience woven into worn fabric. I remember how I used to sleep behind a door that shut out the noise of the world and protected my dreams. Now, the curtain offers no shield, only exposure. I learned to swallow the sting of humiliation, to quiet the sharp ache of rejection that settled deep in my bones. There is a peculiar kind of loneliness in being surrounded by family, yet feeling profoundly alone. My son and his wife treat me with polite distance, their smiles thin and carefully measured, their words clipped as if speaking to a stranger who happens to occupy a room in their house. Their version of care is a checklist of tasks done with the minimum required effort, their attention given only when convenient or performative. I have become the space filler, the silent observer, the guest who overstays her welcome in a home that was never truly hers anymore. When I first noticed the door was gone, I was out running errands, unaware of the quiet coup taking place behind my back. Returning home, I stopped short in the hallway, the familiar barrier replaced by a floral curtain that fluttered lightly in the draft. I reached out to touch the fabric, half expecting the solid oak I had closed behind me 100 times. But there was only the fragile, insubstantial curtain, a flimsy veil between presence and absence. I pulled it aside, cautiously, stepping into the room I once claimed as my own, now feeling like a stranger entering a borrowed space. The walls, once warm with memories and familiar scents, now seemed colder, their bare surfaces echoing the void left by my displaced door. That evening, I watched as my grandchildren passed through the curtain without hesitation or hesitation, their innocent disregard cutting deeper than any harsh word. I realized then that the door was never just a piece of wood. It was a boundary, a symbol of respect and belonging that had quietly been dismantled. I am not angry, not yet, but there is a steady growing ache in my chest, a mourning for the dignity stripped away one small act at a time. Each day the curtain sways a little more, as if mocking my attempts to stake a claim on my own space. I am left wondering how the place where I once felt safe and seen has become a stage for exclusion and erasure. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the curtain, something stubborn stirs inside me, a quiet resolve to reclaim what has been taken, to find a way back to myself in a house that no longer feels like home. I remind myself that a door, no matter how solid, is only a barrier. True boundaries come from within, and I am learning to build those walls again, brick by brick, silent but unyielding. The floral curtain may be thin, but my will is not. This is my story, not of surrender, but of awakening. And though I am here, behind a curtain where once there was a door, I am no longer invisible. The day they took down my bedroom door was the day everything changed. The moment the fragile peace that had kept me tethered to that house shattered without ceremony or explanation. It was a Saturday morning like any other, the sun filtering softly through the windows, casting long golden beams onto the worn carpet where I had spent countless quiet afternoons reading and knitting. I had gone out early to the grocery store, making a careful list and preparing to cook the stew my son liked, the one that reminded him of childhood dinners when laughter filled every corner. I came back carrying bags heavy with fresh vegetables and the smell of baked bread, humming softly to myself, expecting the familiar comfort of home. But as I turned the key in the front door, a strange stillness greeted me, an unnatural quiet that made the hairs on my arms rise. I set the bags down and called out, "Hello? I'm back." No response. The living room was empty, the television off, the house feeling colder, emptier than before. I made my way down the hallway, each step echoing against the walls, until I reached the doorway that should have led into my sanctuary. Instead of the solid, painted wood I had always known, there was a curtain, thin, floral, fluttering softly with the faintest breeze from an open window. I stood frozen for a moment, confusion swirling inside me, before reaching out to brush the fabric aside. The room beyond was familiar, yet stripped of the comfort it once held. My chair was pushed back. The small table where I kept my favorite books was bare, and a faint scent of lavender, foreign and clinical, hung in the air. The doorframe felt hollow without the door itself, a space open to anyone who cared to walk through. That evening, my son Daniel came home with his usual hurried step, dropping his keys on the counter and barely glancing in my direction. "I thought the door was just old and needed to go," he said dismissively when I asked about it, waving his hand as if brushing away an inconsequential detail. His wife Carla was nearby, her smile polite but tight, as if she too wanted to avoid the subject. "We thought the curtain would make things lighter, more open," she added quickly, as if saying it fast would make it true. But I knew better. The absence of my door was not a matter of design or convenience. It was a deliberate act, a quiet assertion that my presence was negotiable, that my boundaries were to be ignored. Over the following days, the truth settled like dust on old furniture. The curtain never closed completely. It was always slightly ajar, an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. The grandchildren, once careful around me, now treated my room like a playground, passing through without knocking, their laughter loud and careless. Carla reorganized my things with brisk efficiency, removing photographs that showed me with my children, folding away the quilts I had stitched by hand, replacing my favorite cups with sterile new ones that felt cold in my grasp. One afternoon, I overheard Carla whisper to Daniel, "She's just taking up space," and the door was the last thing that made it feel like she belonged here. The words cut deeper than any argument, not because they were spoken aloud, but because they were true in their cruelty. I realized then that I had become a ghost in their home, visible only when needed, but otherwise relegated to the shadows. My attempts to speak up were met with gentle silences or quick changes of subject, as if acknowledging my discomfort would make them complicit. When I confronted Daniel one evening, asking why they had taken down the door without telling me, he shrugged and said, "It's for everyone's comfort. We just want things to be easier." But it wasn't about ease. It was about control. Without that door, I had no privacy, no place to close off the world and be myself. I was expected to adapt, to disappear quietly behind a curtain, a faint pattern of flowers that fluttered but never stood firm. The removal of the door was more than a physical act. It was a message that my autonomy was no longer respected, that my role in the family had diminished to something ornamental, something to be tolerated at best. As the weeks passed, the emotional weight grew heavier. I found myself hesitating before entering rooms, questioning whether my presence was wanted or merely endured. The kitchen conversations became shorter, the smiles more forced. I watched as my son and his wife planned outings and events without including me, their calendars filled with family activities from which I was subtly excluded. The house that once felt warm and alive became a stage for a performance of polite neglect. Yet, beneath this quiet erosion of my place in the family, a small but steady flame began to flicker within me. I refused to be erased entirely, to vanish like a forgotten photograph tucked into an old album. Each morning, I told myself that I would find a way to reclaim my dignity, to draw boundaries that could not be crossed by thin curtains or indifferent glances. I started keeping a journal, recording the small acts of exclusion and the words left unspoken. Writing became my refuge, a way to give voice to the pain that otherwise went unnoticed. One afternoon, I found a box of old letters and photographs tucked away in the closet, reminders of a time when I was seen, when my presence mattered beyond the walls of this house. Holding those faded images, I remembered who I was before the curtain, before the silent dismissal. I was a woman who had loved fiercely, who had built a family with her hands and heart. I was not ready to surrender that identity, no matter how thin the fabric that now separated me from the world. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house slept and the curtain swayed gently in the breeze, I made a decision. I would not wait for their permission or pity. I would find a way to assert my boundaries, to reclaim the privacy and respect that had been stripped away. The curtain might flutter and fall, but I would stand firm. And so, the removal of my bedroom door was not just an act of exclusion, but a catalyst, a beginning of a journey toward reclaiming my self-worth and autonomy in a house that had grown too small for my spirit. The path ahead would not be easy, but I knew that beneath the thin fabric of that curtain, I was ready to rise. The removal of the door was only the first in a series of quiet, almost imperceptible moves designed to erode my presence. each one a small but steady drip of isolation that seeped into the corners of my life until the house I once called home felt foreign and unwelcoming. At first, these acts were subtle, almost innocent to an outsider, but to me, they built up like layers of dust, thick and suffocating. My belongings began to disappear without explanation. A photograph here, a favorite scarf there, all swept away with the same clinical detachment that had accompanied the removal of my door. One morning, I reached for my toothbrush, only to find it missing. Later, Carla casually mentioned that she had cleaned out the clutter, her tone light, as if dismissing a mess left by a stranger. It was never a confrontation, no raised voices, no accusations, but the message was unmistakable. I was being erased, piece by piece, as if my existence was a problem to be solved rather than a presence to be respected. The children, once gentle and curious, had learned the unspoken rules of this new arrangement. They entered my curtained room without knocking, speaking loudly and sometimes laughing at things that felt like secret jokes to which I was not invited. Their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors, a soundtrack to my shrinking world. One afternoon, as I sat quietly in my makeshift sanctuary, I overheard my grandson ask his mother why Grandma's room didn't have a door anymore. Carla's response, sharp and dismissive, was not meant for me, but landed like a slap in the silence. Because she doesn't need one. She's just here to fill space. The words hung in the air long after they left the room, settling like a dark cloud over my heart. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and shared meals, became another site of exclusion. I found myself pushed to the margins during family dinners. My seat shifted to a corner where I could observe but not participate fully. Conversations flowed around me, snippets of plans and jokes that I was not part of. The laughter was lighter when I was in the room, as if people were conscious of my presence but reluctant to include me. When I tried to join in, my words were met with polite nods or hurried changes of subject. There was no cruelty in their reactions, only a calculated distance, a quiet closing of ranks that left me on the outside looking in. On some days, the house felt like a stage where I played the part of the nice old lady, the one who smiled and nodded, but was never really seen. I became acutely aware of how much space I occupied, not just physically, but emotionally, and how every inch of that space was being contested and diminished. Even the pantry was locked behind a door I was told I no longer had access to. Carla explained it was just for safety, a way to keep the children from grabbing snacks unsupervised. But I knew the truth. It was another boundary drawn to keep me out, to remind me that my role was limited, that my needs were secondary. I tried to hold on to the small rituals that had once grounded me. The morning cup of tea brewed exactly as I liked it. The evenings spent reading by the window. But even these were disrupted. The teapot was replaced with a modern appliance that buzzed and beeped, unfamiliar and uninviting. My favorite chair was moved to the far side of the living room, out of the way, where I could watch but not engage. The days stretched long and lonely, punctuated by moments of quiet despair and a growing sense of invisibility. Friends I once counted on stopped calling, or their visits became less frequent, their concern muffled by the polite explanations I gave to avoid embarrassment. I found myself withdrawing, retreating behind the curtain that now served as my door, wrapping myself in a cocoon of silence. Yet, even in the midst of this quiet erasure, a small voice inside me refused to be silenced. I began to keep a notebook, jotting down thoughts, memories, and small acts of resistance. Each entry was a declaration that I was still here, still worthy of being heard and seen. I wrote about the ache of exclusion, and the stubborn hope that one day I would reclaim my place, not as a shadow or an afterthought, but as a woman deserving of respect and belonging. There were moments when the weight of loneliness pressed so heavily on my chest that I wondered if I could endure much longer. I caught myself staring at the curtain, imagining tearing it down, demanding the door back, demanding recognition. But I knew that anger alone would not restore what had been lost. I needed a different kind of strength, one that came from patience, strategy, and a fierce belief in my own worth. Over time, I noticed how the patterns of exclusion extended beyond the walls of the house. Invitations to family gatherings became fewer, explanations more vague. My son's phone calls were shorter, filled with logistical details rather than warmth or inquiry. I realized that the curtain was not just a physical barrier, but a symbol of a deeper divide, one that separated me from the life I had once known and the family I had loved. The first escalation was not marked by any single dramatic moment, but by a slow, creeping erosion of presence and voice. It was in the silent meals eaten alone, the doors closed softly but firmly in my face, the casual dismissals that accumulated until I felt like a ghost haunting a home that no longer belonged to me. Yet even in this shadowed place, I began to gather fragments of myself, pieces that refused to be discarded or forgotten. I sought out quiet corners in the neighborhood, walked slowly along streets lined with unfamiliar trees, and found solace in the soft rhythm of my own breath. In those solitary moments, I reminded myself that I was more than a curtained room, more than the sum of their dismissals. I was a woman with a past, a history of love and strength, and a future that I still had the power to shape. The first escalation was a lesson in resilience, a painful but necessary step in the journey toward reclaiming autonomy. It taught me to recognize the subtle forms of exclusion that can be as damaging as overt rejection, to hold on to dignity even when it feels like the world is closing in. It was the moment I began to understand that the path forward would require not just endurance, but action. Quiet, deliberate, and unyielding. Though the curtain remained in place, fluttering softly in the breeze, the woman behind it was no longer invisible. She was gathering strength, preparing to rise. In the dim quiet of the nights, when the house settled and all the usual noises softened into a familiar lull, I found myself touching the edges of the curtain more often, running my fingers along the thin rod that barely held it in place. The fabric was fragile, faded from sunlight and time, yet it was the only boundary I had left between myself and the rest of the world within that house. That delicate barrier, once a symbol of exclusion, became for me a threshold, a point of transition from the woman who had been quietly erased to one who began to stir with new intention. The weeks of quiet erosion and subtle dismissal had worn at my spirit, but beneath the surface, a shift was occurring. A slow, steady reclaiming of my own agency, the first cracks in the wall of invisibility. It began with small acts of defiance and self-care that others would dismiss as inconsequential, but which, to me, marked a profound transformation. I started by taking short walks outside, something I had not done alone for many years. The neighborhood around the house was familiar, yet changed, and I moved cautiously at first, the uneven sidewalks a metaphor for the uncertain path I was beginning to walk. With every step, the weight of isolation eased a little, replaced by the crisp air and the subtle pulse of life beyond the curtained doorway. In those walks, I rediscovered the rhythm of my own breathing, the steady cadence of feet against pavement, and the quiet resilience of a body that, though aged and worn, was still capable of movement and change. At the same time, I opened a hidden savings account I had kept untouched for years, a small but precious fund reserved from my own earnings long before the fractures in my family began. It was a secret lifeline, an assertion of financial independence that I had kept quietly, fearing confrontation, but now nurturing as a seed of hope. Each deposit and withdrawal was a reminder that I still held some control, some power over my own future. As I counted the bills and balanced the numbers, I felt a growing sense of possibility that had been absent for so long. Within the curtained room, I made subtle changes as well, small acts of reclaiming space and identity. I rearranged my few possessions with care, placing cherished photos and mementos in new positions where they caught the light, refusing to be hidden or dismissed. I found an empty picture frame in the closet and placed it prominently on the bedside table, an intentional void that spoke volumes. It was a symbol of the absence I felt, but also a promise that space would be made for something new. I began writing again, filling pages of a journal with thoughts, memories, and plans. Writing became my sanctuary, a way to articulate the pain and the hope entwined in my heart. Through the words, I reclaimed my voice, no longer silent or small, but deliberate and clear. In the evenings, I sat by the curtained window, watching the world outside continue without me, but feeling less like a passive observer and more like a woman preparing to step back into the light. The greatest shift came not from rebellion or confrontation, but from a quiet awakening to my own worth and resilience. I stopped asking for permission or validation from those who had diminished me and began to build an inner sanctuary of strength. The curtain that once felt like a cage became a veil, a soft boundary I could cross and recross on my own terms. It was during this time that I planned my next steps carefully, considering what freedom might look like beyond the walls that confined me. I researched small rental apartments and community centers, places where I could live with dignity and autonomy. I reached out quietly to an old friend who had moved to a nearby town, rekindling a connection that had faded but never fully broken. Each phone call, each message exchanged, was a lifeline back to the world I had been slipping away from. I found comfort in the simple rituals of daily life, brewing tea exactly as I liked it, reading books borrowed from the local library, tending to a small collection of houseplants that brought life and color to my curtained room. These acts were small but significant, each one a declaration that I was more than the sum of the dismissals and exclusions I had endured. At night I dreamed again, not of returning to a past that had been fractured, but of a future shaped by my own choices. I imagined a life where I was not defined by the boundaries others imposed, but by the freedom I carved out for myself. The midpoint of my journey was not a dramatic confrontation or a sudden escape, but a slow, steady turning inward and then outward. A gathering of strength, a reclaiming of space, both physical and emotional. It was the moment I began to see myself not as a burden or a problem to be managed, but as a woman worthy of respect, autonomy, and love. This shift was fragile and gradual, marked by moments of doubt and fear, but propelled by a stubborn hope that refused to be extinguished. The curtain remained in place, its floral pattern a quiet reminder of the past. But behind it, I was no longer waiting for permission or approval. I was preparing to step beyond the confines of that curtained room and into a life of my own making, a life where boundaries were mine to define and protect. The house seemed to grow smaller every day, the walls closing in with quiet accusations that I was becoming less, fading like a shadow in a dimming room. After the slow erosion of my privacy, the removal of my door, the subtle shuffling of my belongings, and the curt dismissal of my presence, a new wave of exclusion began to surge. harsher, and more direct than before. It was as if my family, having already pushed me behind a curtain where I was barely visible, now sought to finish the job, to push me entirely out of their lives and their home. The second escalation arrived not with the quiet indifference of before, but with a cold, calculated firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. One evening, as the twilight cast long shadows across the living room floor, I overheard my son, Daniel, and his wife, Carla, speaking in hushed tones near the kitchen doorway. Their voices were low, laced with the familiar mix of frustration and certainty that I had come to dread. "She's using too much hot water again," Carla said sharply, her words clipped like commands. "It's driving up the bills, and it's not like she even needs a full shower every day." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture I had seen before when he was trying to reconcile his guilt with his resolve. "We've talked about assisted living. Maybe it's time to start making arrangements." The phrase hit me like a cold wave, an announcement not directed at me but about me, as if I were not in the room but merely an object of discussion. Assisted living. The words conjured images of sterile rooms, strangers' voices, and the final severing of ties that had once bound me to my family. I felt the room tilt beneath me, the fragile ground of my remaining autonomy crumbling. Later that night, I confronted Daniel quietly, choosing my words carefully as if each one were a precious commodity. "I heard what you said," I began, my voice steady, but edged with a pain I could not fully mask. "Do you think I'm ready to leave my home? To be someone else's responsibility?" He looked away, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," he said. "Someplace safe with people who can help." "Safe," I echoed, the word tasting bitter. "I have safety here. It's not in a place where I'm just a resident, waiting to be managed." The conversation ended with no resolution, only a cold silence that settled between us like dust. The next morning, as I made my way down the hallway, the fabric of the curtain stirring softly in the morning breeze, I noticed the mattress in my son's bedroom had been replaced. It was a new memory foam model, sleek and expensive, a stark contrast to the worn spring mattress it had supplanted. The mattress symbolized something more than comfort. It was a fortress of control and detachment, a physical manifestation of the emotional walls growing thicker between us. I observed how Daniel praised the mattress, talking about its benefits for his back and how it made his sleep deeper and more restful. The luxury of it felt like a silent taunt, a reminder that my needs and comforts were no longer part of the household equation. That night, as the house quieted and the shadows lengthened, I carried out a quiet act of reclamation. I gathered several large bags of ice from the local store, heavy and cold in my hands, and brought them up the stairs to Daniel's room. Without a word, I carefully removed his pristine sheets and slid the bags beneath the mattress cover, layering cold packets strategically where his body would rest. The icy chill seeped through the fabric, a subtle but persistent discomfort that would disrupt his sleep and unsettle the comfort he had so easily claimed. I left the room silently, the soft click of the door echoing like a whispered message. Boundaries are not given lightly, and respect is not to be assumed. The next morning, the house woke to an unusual tension. Daniel emerged from his room, looking disheveled and confused, muttering about restless sleep and strange chills. Carla noticed immediately, her concern tinged with suspicion. "Did you feel the air conditioning?" "Maybe it's just the new system," she speculated, but the unease lingered. I said nothing, watching from my curtained refuge as the discomfort settled like a quiet victory. The act was not born of spite or malice, but of a need to reclaim a measure of power in a situation where I had been stripped of so much. It was a reminder that I was still here, that my presence mattered, even if others chose to ignore it. The weeks that followed saw a tightening of control over my daily life. Carla began dictating my schedule, suggesting when I should eat, sleep, and even bathe, framing her commands as concern, but wielding them as tools of domination. Daniel joined in, reinforcing the narrative that my independence was fragile and that I was better off under their watchful eyes. Invitations to family dinners became rare and conditional, often postponed or canceled with excuses of too much going on. When I did attend, I was treated with a forced politeness, the warmth of genuine connection replaced by a chilly civility that left me feeling more like a guest than a mother or grandmother. The grandchildren, sensing the tensions, became more distant, their interactions perfunctory and brief. The house, once filled with the joyful chaos of family life, felt like a carefully curated stage where my role was minimized to that of a silent observer, a relic to be tolerated but not engaged. Despite the increasing pressure and the deepening isolation, I refused to yield completely. Each day, I guarded my small acts of defiance, the quiet withdrawals from my savings, the long walks taken without permission, the notes written in the privacy of my curtained room. I sought solace in books, in letters to old friends, in memories that no one could take away. The second escalation was a test, a push to see how much I would endure before breaking. But I found strength in the quiet corners of my soul, resilience in the knowledge that my worth was not determined by their acceptance or control. It was during this time that I began to plan more earnestly for a life beyond their confines. I researched apartments and community centers, places where I could live with dignity and autonomy, away from the prying eyes and controlling hands that had sought to diminish me. I reached out discreetly to a local support group for older women, finding comfort in shared stories and the knowledge that I was not alone in my struggle. The curtain remained in place, a symbol of the boundary they sought to enforce. But behind it, I was gathering courage, building a new foundation for myself. The second escalation was painful and isolating, but it was also a catalyst, forcing me to confront the reality of my situation and to take steps toward reclaiming my life. The cold mattress and whispered conversations were reminders that the battle for dignity was ongoing, but they also ignited a determination within me to rise above the quiet oppression. In the depths of those challenging days, I learned that strength is often found not in grand gestures, but in the small, steadfast acts of self-preservation and hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I could see a glimmer of light beyond the curtained doorway, a promise of freedom and respect waiting to be claimed. The moment I decided to leave was not born from rage, but from a deep and quiet resolve that had been growing inside me for months, nourished by the small acts of defiance and the steady realization that the life I was living was no longer mine to claim. It came one morning as I sat behind the faded floral curtain that had replaced my bedroom door, watching the sunlight filter weakly through the thin fabric, casting pale shadows across the room that had become both my prison and my sanctuary. The curtain fluttered softly in the morning breeze, a delicate veil between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I had spent countless nights imagining what it would be like to step beyond that curtain, to reclaim my space, my dignity, and my autonomy. On that day, the imagining became a plan. I rose from the narrow bed with a steady breath, feeling the weight of years pressing on my shoulders, but also the lightness of a choice finally made. I packed a single suitcase, carefully selecting the few belongings I would take, my journal filled with scribbled thoughts and plans, a worn sweater that had comforted me through difficult days, and a small collection of photographs that reminded me of who I was beyond the curtained room. I folded each item with care, a ritual of respect for the life I was leaving behind and the life I was about to begin. There was no note, no dramatic farewell, only the quiet certainty that I did not owe anyone an explanation for reclaiming my freedom. The morning was still and cool as I slipped out of the house, the familiar creak of the front door behind me sounding like the closing of a chapter and the opening of another. I hailed a cab with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the power of choice, and I gave the driver the address of a modest rental I had found through a community bulletin, a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood where I could live on my own terms. The journey was surreal, the cityscape blurring past the window as memories and hopes mingled in my mind. Upon arriving, I stepped into a space that was both humble and full of possibility. The apartment was small but clean, with a sturdy door that locked firmly behind me and windows that opened to a view of leafy trees and the distant hum of life. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. I unpacked slowly, arranging my few belongings in the empty rooms with a sense of reverence, each act a reclamation of space and self. That night, I lay in a bed that was mine alone, the sheets cool and crisp, and for the first time in a long while, I slept without the shadow of exclusion or dismissal pressing on my chest. The days that followed were filled with quiet discoveries. The joy of brewing my own coffee in the morning, the freedom to read and write without interruption, and the simple pleasure of locking the door behind me and knowing that my privacy was no longer negotiable. I began to explore the neighborhood, finding solace in the rhythms of daily life beyond the confines of the curtained room. I met neighbors who greeted me with genuine smiles and conversations that acknowledged my presence without reservation or pity. Each interaction, no matter how small, was a thread weaving me back into the fabric of community and belonging. One afternoon, a letter arrived, addressed to me at the new address. It was from my son Daniel, terse and filled with a mixture of anger and regret. He accused me of abandoning the family, of causing unnecessary drama, and demanded that I reconsider my decision to leave. There was no acknowledgement of the months of exclusion, the removal of my door, or the cold mattress that had been a silent battleground. The letter was a final attempt to assert control, to rewrite the story of my departure in terms that suited them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, a reminder of the fractured ties I had left behind, but no longer allowed to define me. In the weeks that followed, I found strength not in confrontation, but in the quiet building of a new life. I joined a local book club where the discussion sparked new interests and friendships. I volunteered at a community garden, feeling the earth beneath my hands and the sun on my face, a tangible connection to growth and renewal. I reconnected with an old friend who had moved to the area, her companionship a balm for the loneliness that sometimes crept in. The climax of my journey was not a dramatic showdown, but a personal declaration, a setting of boundaries that were clear and unyielding. I wrote a letter to the lawyer Daniel had sent on their behalf, stating firmly that I was of sound mind, living independently, and no longer wished to be contacted under the guise of concern. The letter was concise, legal in tone but resolute in spirit. I sent it with the same steady hand that had once nurtured a family, now signing it as a woman reclaiming her dignity. The final act of reclaiming my power was symbolic and deeply personal. One evening, as the sun set in hues of amber and rose, I stood at the threshold of my new home, the door firmly shut behind me. I placed a small plaque on the door, a simple wooden sign that read, "Not a guest, a resident." It was a quiet but profound assertion that I was no longer invisible, no longer a shadow behind a curtain, but a woman who had reclaimed her space and her voice. This moment, more than any confrontation or argument, marked the turning point, the culmination of months of quiet suffering, resilience, and renewal. In the safety of my own home, I found peace not because I had severed ties with my past, but because I had embraced the possibility of a future shaped by my own choices. The curtain was gone, the door was solid, and the boundaries were mine to keep. And in that, I found not just freedom, but a profound healing, a restoration of self that no one could take away. In the weeks and months that followed my departure, a new rhythm settled into my life, one marked by quiet moments of peace and the slow rebuilding of my sense of self that had long been overshadowed by exclusion and dismissal. My small apartment, once unfamiliar and bare, grew into a sanctuary filled with the textures and colors of my choosing, a place where I was no longer a guest, but a resident, fully present and respected. Each morning began with the ritual of brewing coffee just the way I liked it, savoring the rich aroma and the warmth of the cup in my hands. These simple acts, once taken for granted, now carried profound meaning, reminders that I was capable of caring for myself and reclaiming the pleasures that life could still offer. Outside my window, the neighborhood bustled gently with the sounds of children playing, birds singing, and neighbors greeting one another in passing. I walked these streets often, rediscovering the joy of solitude and the comforting rhythm of a body in motion. With every step, the heavy weight of past burdens lifted, replaced by a growing confidence that I was no longer tethered to a life that sought to diminish me. One of the most unexpected gifts of this new chapter was the rekindling of relationships that had faded, but never fully broken. I reached out to my grandson Kieran, the one family member who had shown warmth and concern when others had turned away. Our conversations began cautiously, tentative bridges built over years of silence and pain. He spoke softly, without judgment or expectation, simply wanting to know how I was and to share pieces of his life with me. In return, I listened with an open heart, grateful for a connection that felt genuine and healing. Kieran's letters and phone calls became a thread, weaving me back into the fabric of family, not as an obligation or a shadow, but as a person worthy of love and respect. With time, we arranged to meet in a quiet cafe, a neutral space where the past could be set aside and the possibility of a new beginning could take root. Our meeting was not marked by dramatic apologies or tearful reconciliations, but by the gentle unfolding of understanding and mutual respect. We shared stories, laughter, and moments of silence that spoke volumes. It was a reminder that healing often comes not from grand gestures, but from small, sincere steps taken with courage and patience. Meanwhile, my son Daniel and his wife Carla remained distant, their attempts to reconnect half-hearted and tinged with the old patterns of control and dismissal. I chose not to engage in battles that would only reopen wounds and diminish the peace I was cultivating. Instead, I focused on building a life that was fully mine, one where boundaries were respected and my voice was heard. I found solace in community activities, a book club where ideas flowed freely, a gardening group where hands worked the soil and hearts connected over shared purpose. These spaces nurtured my spirit and reminded me that I was not alone, that there were others who valued presence, kindness, and dignity. The quiet evenings spent reading by the window, the laughter shared with new friends over cups of tea, the satisfaction of caring for my small home, all these moments wove together into a tapestry of resilience and renewal. One night, as the city lights flickered outside and the gentle hum of life filled the air, I wrote a letter, not to my family, not to those who had once excluded me, but to myself. In steady handwriting, I penned words of compassion and strength. Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot that you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. Look at the life you have built. Well done. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer of my dresser, a private reminder of the journey I had traveled and the woman I had become. The days continued, marked not by grand celebrations, but by the quiet certainty of belonging. To myself, to my community, and to the life I had chosen. The shadows of the past still lingered at times, but they no longer held power over me. I had stepped beyond the curtain, through the door I had reclaimed, and into a future defined not by others' expectations, but by my own voice and will. And so, my story is one of release and rediscovery, of finding freedom not in returning to what was lost, but in building something new. To any woman who finds herself behind a curtain where once there was a door, know this: your worth is not diminished by others' disregard, and your voice is waiting to be heard. It is never too late to step into the light, to claim your space, and to live a life of your own making. When you do, you will find that the door you thought was closed was only waiting for you to open it from the inside. They told me it was just a small favor, something that wouldn't take much of my time, a way for me to be useful now that I didn't have a job anymore. My daughter, Claire, said it with that soft, patronizing tone she had perfected over the years. Mom, you can help us out by picking up Sophie from school a few days a week. It'll keep you busy, you know? Busy, as if my life were an empty box in need of filling. I agreed at first because I love my granddaughter, and the thought of spending more time with her seemed like a gift. But a gift should be freely given and joyfully received, not twisted into a quiet obligation that begins to consume your days, your energy, and eventually your sense of self. It started small, 2 afternoons a week, just until they got through a busy period at work. I'd walk the familiar streets to the school, stand among the other grandparents and parents, and watch Sophie's face light up when she saw me. We'd walk home together, talking about her day, her friends, the things she was learning. It felt good in the beginning. But soon, 2 afternoons became 3, then 4, until it was every single weekday, rain or shine, whether I was feeling well or not. My daughter never asked if it was convenient. She simply assumed I'd be there, a permanent fixture in Sophie's routine. The real shift happened one afternoon when I was feeling unwell, dizzy, my legs unsteady beneath me. I called Claire at work and said I couldn't manage the walk to the school that day. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath, and then her voice turned cold. Well, I guess I'll just have to leave early and explain to my boss why. My 74-year-old mother can't even pick up her own granddaughter. The guilt slid in like a knife between my ribs. I pushed myself out the door, heart pounding, telling myself I could rest later. That was the day I understood this wasn't help I was giving. It was a debt they believed I owed. As months passed, my role expanded beyond school pickups. I became the default babysitter whenever they wanted an evening out, the emergency backup when Sophie was homesick, the stand-in parent for school events. My own plans, rare as they were rearranged or canceled entirely if they conflicted with what Claire needed. If I ever hesitated or tried to say no, I was met with the same heavy sigh and veiled accusations. We just thought you'd want to be part of her life. I guess we were wrong. What hurt most wasn't the exhaustion or the loss of my own time. It was the quiet erasure of my personhood. I stopped being seen as a mother, a woman with her own life and choices, and became a convenience. I noticed it in the way Claire spoke to me, as if I were an employee she was only barely satisfied with. I noticed it in how Sophie's thank yous became automatic, almost rehearsed, like something she'd been told to say without really thinking about it. The breaking point came one winter evening when the roads were slick with ice. Claire and her husband had gone to some dinner, leaving me with Sophie. I slipped on their front steps while taking the trash out and fell hard, my hips screaming in pain. I lay there in the cold, snow seeping into my coat, calling for Sophie to get my phone. Claire's number was on the screen in seconds, and when she answered, I told her what happened, my voice trembling. She didn't ask if I was all right. She didn't offer to come home. She just said, "Well, I guess you'll have to wait until we're done here. Can you make it inside? We're in the middle of dessert." Something in me broke cleanly then, not from the fall, but from the realization that I was a placeholder, a tool, a reliable background presence that they assumed would never falter. I managed to get inside, wincing with every step, and sat down in their kitchen with a blanket wrapped around me. When they came home hours later, Claire's only comment was, "You should have been more careful." That night, in the small apartment I still kept but rarely used because I was always at their house, I made a decision. I would not be their silent servant anymore. I would not keep erasing my needs and my health to make their lives more comfortable. The next day, I called Claire and told her I could no longer be the default caretaker. My voice was steady, my words chosen carefully. "I love Sophie, but I can't keep doing this. My life matters too, Claire. I need my own time, my own health, my own dignity." The reaction was as I expected: anger, accusations of selfishness, cold silences. But beneath her fury, I could hear something else. The realization that I meant what I said, that I would not be persuaded by guilt or obligation anymore. The first week was hard. I missed Sophie's daily chatter, her hand in mine on the walk home. But I began to fill my days with things I had pushed aside: visits to the library, long walks by the river, mornings spent in cafes with a book and no clock ticking over my head. Months later, Sophie visited me at my apartment for the first time. She looked around at the plants in the window, the books stacked neatly on the shelves, the warmth of the small space. "It's nice here, Grandma," she said, curling up on my sofa. I smiled, feeling something loosen in my chest. "It's mine," I told her. "All mine." And in that moment, I knew I had taken back more than my time. I had taken back myself.